So last week we went through some of the, I guess, often overlooked details of Moses' life. So we're going to do a quick warm-up quiz, just to warm up your brains, plus maybe toss in a few additional details. What does the name Moses mean? Close. Yeah, pretty almost right on. Drawn out. And I think I made a statement in the video that I might have to correct, because didn't I say that was an Egyptian? Or did I say it was an Egyptian name or a Hebrew name?
That we didn't know his Hebrew name.
Yeah. So I did a little bit more poking, and it could be one or both. The word that you see in the Bible, Moshe, is Hebrew, but his name was given to him by the Egyptian princess, right? We're not told any name that Moses' mother or father gave him. We're just told that he was drawn out of the water, and then the princess called him Moses because she drew him out of the water. We also know that he was nursed by his own mother, right? But he was adopted by the princess and was brought up in the royal household. What were the names of Moses' parents? Ooh, very good. Jochebed, mother or father? Mother. What about the father? Yeah, pretty fancy, right?
But Jochebed?
Yeah, what is the dad's name? Dad.
I don't know the dad.
The father's name was Amram.
Oh, yeah.
Levi had 3 sons. One of his sons was Kohath. And then Kohath had a son named Amram. And Amram had Moses and Aaron, and of course Miriam, right? And the first thing to notice is that, or one of the things to notice is that Moses was only 3 generations removed from Levi, right? It wasn't this long chain of genealogy, and all of a sudden we have Moses. He was only, or to say it another way, Levi was Moses' great-great-grandfather, is what he was. So what about Jochebed? Jochebed was actually Amram's aunt. He married his own aunt. He was Amram, or not Amram's, who was Kohath's sister, his father's sister. And I'm just going to throw out a couple of random questions here just to kind of get the creative juices flowing. Not creative that I want you to make stuff up, though. Do you think Moses was circumcised?
Yes.
I have a no, I have a yes. Arguments for both sides.
Because he was 3 months old when they put him in the water.
He was. Yeah, so that would imply, right? Because what was the tradition?
8 days.
On the 8th day.
Which I thought of reading this or hearing or whatever is that the princess knew when she took him out of the water that he was Jewish.
He would have had to, because he probably was circumcised, right? So she knew that he was a Hebrew. So making that assumption, if we go back to the name, like, was Moses an Egyptian name or a Hebrew name? Either the princess knew something of Hebrew and used a Hebrew name because she knew he was a Hebrew child, or there's another possible explanation. Can anybody puzzle it out?
His mother helped, maybe?
Maybe his mother helped. Would have been after the fact, right? Maybe the same day. Well, it's kind of hard to say, but.
Well, Moses' mother was taken to the princess's chambers, right?
Well, there is a verse in Exodus that says that when Miriam went off to get the wet nurse, the mother, Jochebed, it said that she nursed him, and when he had grown, she brought him to the princess. So the implication is that Moses was with his mother outside of the royal household, or maybe in the royal palace, but not, under the direct supervision of the princess. It's kind of a little bit of a nebulous verse that kind of leaves it open that there may have been a period of time from when the princess took him out of the water to when he actually came to her as her adopted son.
It would be better for him to be with his mother and father.
Could be, yeah. And whether the princess knew that was really the mother and father. But there was, in these ancient cultures, and I can't remember what the term was, but basically any abandoned child, if a child was abandoned the way that they did with Moses, they, from a legal standpoint, they forfeit all of their parental rights and can't reclaim them. Right? So even if the princess had known and the Pharaoh knew that Moses was a Hebrew boy, and I'm assuming that the Pharaoh didn't have the baby killed right away, even if he knew that he was a Hebrew, because his daughter fell in love with him, right?
He didn't want to face his daughter.
Yeah, maybe that's what it was, the wrath of the princess. So here, how about this as a possible alternate explanation? I don't know what the answer is, but some scholars have suggested that he was given an Egyptian name that kind of has the same meaning as drawn out. Some linguists have suggested that, and I don't know how to pronounce it in Egyptian, but basically it's an Egyptian word that kind of looks and spells somewhat like Moses or Moshe, that literally means child of the Nile. So it could be that she named him
Yes.
child of the Nile in Egyptian, and it just so happened to be pretty close to Moses. And so maybe when Moses was with his biological family, they called him Moses instead of the Egyptian version that
Because
really
they
kind of
could-
means the same thing.
They could speak Egyptian very well.
I'm sure they could, because every single
they
one of
did,
these
yes.
people was born in Egypt.
I just always assumed that Moses was Hebrew, Jewish, whatever, because that's what God called him. And if you look at Daniel, Daniel had a Babylonian name, but he never went by that. It always calls him Daniel. When it does it Meshach, whatever, and
Yes.
Abednego.
He was Belteshazzar.
Yeah. He was never referred to that. I mean, referred to it a couple of times.
Yes.
God talked to him as Daniel, the angels, Christ, whatever. And the same thing with Moses. And there are so many, I mean, Moses' name goes down and down and down through
Even
the generations. And I just never thought they would perpetuate an Egyptian
An
name.
Egyptian name, right?
So I just always have assumed it was
right, and what Judy's pointing out is that Moses, first of all, he wrote these books, right?
Yeah.
And he wrote everything in retrospect. So it probably is likely that he was given an Egyptian name, which was then either transliterated into Hebrew, and that's what he referred to himself as he was writing these things, because that was the Hebrew name. And I think you kind of nailed it on the head. I think
Did
that's
he write
exactly.
in Hebrew?
Originally, yes. And I say originally because the oldest existing copies of the Hebrew Old Testament are from 1100 AD. But he would have written in Hebrew.
So he learned Hebrew somewhere.
Yeah.
That would have been from his parents.
Yeah. Yeah, and that was one of the things that I pointed out last week, is that, he grew up
It's a long
a long week. He grew up in the royal household, but he knew exactly who he was. He knew who his brother Aaron was. He identified with his brethren, so at some point he rejected, his position as the son of the daughter. He refused to be referred to as the son of the daughter of Pharaoh. Right? And and this brings me actually to the next question. How old was he when he killed the Egyptian and fled to Midian?
40.
He was 40 years old, right? And so he fled to Midian. He met this guy named Jethro, who was a priest of Midian. Does anyone know who Midian is or was?
The son of somebody.
Yep. It's a good guess.
He
was-
the son of somebody.
Oh.
No. He actually would have been Ishmael's half-brother. Midian was a son of Abraham with Keturah, whom he married after Sarah died. So Jethro would have been some kind of a distant cousin to Moses at somewhere along the way. And so Moses married Jethro's daughter named Zipporah, and with Zipporah he had two sons named... You're doing so good with all the names. You
Well, I
pulled
just
Jochebed
know
out.
that they ended up being the sons that God attributed to Moses were actually Aaron's sons later on. You don't see Moses' sons after their first mention.
Well, so his
Gershom.
firstborn son, and it states
Gershom.
specifically Gershom, was born to him through Zipporah. And the name Gershom literally means to churn or to toss. And sometimes it's used in one place, I think it's in Isaiah, it's used to describe a troubled sea. But when Gershom was born, Moses named him Gershom because he said, I've been a stranger in a foreign land, right? With the idea that he's just been kind of tossed around in a land that was not his own. And Gershom is the son that Zipporah, if you guys did your homework and read through Exodus, you probably came upon that section. I think it's in Exodus either 3 or chapter 4, where Moses meets Aaron, and he's got Zipporah and his son Gershom with him, and they're heading back to Egypt to confront Pharaoh. And then it says the Lord met him at an inn and sought to kill Moses. And then Zipporah circumcised their son Gershom and tossed the circumcised foreskin at his feet and said, you're a husband of blood to me, or something like that. The Septuagint, by the way, reads a little bit differently, because in the Hebrew Old Testament, it makes it seem like there was a lot of conflict and confrontation between Zipporah and Moses. But the Septuagint doesn't read that way at all. It's almost like she was participating in the circumcision of Gershom to protect her husband, right? And so how many of you read that passage? You went through? Or remember it from reading it somewhere in the past? Like, why do you think it said, like, first of all, Moses meets God in the burning bush, and he says, hey, I'm going to send you back to Pharaoh to let my people go. And then so Moses starts obeying him, but on the way back, God meets him again and says he wanted to kill Moses. Why do you think that is? And what averted the wrath of God in that moment?
When she circumcised.
When she circumcised him was what averted God's wrath, which implies what?
Moses knew he needed to be circumcised.
And he didn't. And it was either he knew it just simply because it was just what Jewish people did as a sign of the covenant, or perhaps unrecorded in the story, perhaps God said, hey, before you go back, make sure your son is circumcised, because he's not. Right? So we don't know. All we know is we have this, and it seems very out of place. All of a sudden, God shows up and he's going to kill him. Well, that doesn't make any sense if all you do is read on the surface, because he just told him to go back and convince Pharaoh to let my people go. And by the way, I'm going to have your brother speak for you, and I'm going to give you this rod, and you can do miracles with it. Oh, by the way, I'm going to kill you, so you can't do everything I just said.
It's almost like a picture of the last plague.
With
The firstborn.
the firstborn, yeah.
Son and blood covering and being set apart.
Yeah.
Kind of reminds me of when the things that happened to Jacob, where Jacob was going along fine, but then he'd have to stop, whether God forced him to or not. He'd have to stop and get rid of all the idols with all of his wives and people that he got. And then
That's
he'd
strange.
go on again, and then he'd have to stop for some other reason and clean up camp and do things. And it's kind of the same way with Moses. Moses knew he was supposed to do that, he didn't.
Oh, it's
Still
puzzles.
carrying baggage from the old
Yeah,
ways.
That's a consistent theme throughout the Bible, isn't it?
kind of like us.
Yeah, absolutely. Go to Judges chapter 18 for a second. I want to show you some commentary about Gershom, because his second son, Moses' second son, his name is Eliezer, and there's absolutely no information about him. But we know Eliezer is the second son because he's mentioned later. Here is actually mentioned in, I believe it's in Judges, but Judges 18, and we're fast forwarding in the story of the Jews here for a second, but I just want to show you what the fate of the children of Moses was, or at least the grandchildren. Judges 18:30 says, then the children of Dan set up for themselves the carved image. And so the context here is how the tribe of Dan basically abandoned the faith and became apostate. And Dan, by the way, later was one of the two cities where, when the kingdom split, if you remember the northern tribes under Jeroboam, he set up two different capital cities. And in each city there was a temple, there was a golden calf for pagan worship. Dan was one of those. So he says, then the children of Dan set up for themselves the carved image. And Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Manasseh, and his sons were priests to the tribe of Dan until the day of the captivity of the land. So they set up for themselves Micah's carved image, which he made all the time that the house of God was in Shiloh. Now, in verse 30, where it says, Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Manasseh, The Latin Vulgate and certain copies of the Septuagint have Moses there instead of Manasseh. And there are a lot of scholars that believe that the Jews, the Jewish scribes, changed the name Moses to Manasseh to protect his reputation and his legacy. Because if this truly was Moses, then basically what this is saying is that the grandson of Moses, Jonathan, became a pagan priest in the city of Dan. Doesn't reflect too well on your prophet, right? But what we like is we like the unvarnished truth. We like to see the reality of these biblical figures, warts and all, right? We want to see them as real people. So you might want to make a note there, the son of Manasseh. I said several different Bible versions or original text and manuscripts have the word or the name Moses there. So we have Gershon, we have Eleazar. The name Eleazar means help or assistance, because when he was born, Moses said, "The God of my father was my help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh." How old was Moses when God spoke to him from the burning bush and said, "Go back to Egypt"? He was 80. Healthy 80 or not?
He was, because he was healthy when he died.
Yeah.
Wasn't he?
120 years old, right, when he died. And if you go back and you read the passage about when Moses is arguing with God, and he's like, surely you can find someone better. I don't speak too good. And then God said, well, what about your brother Aaron? Right, I'm going to send him. So if you read in between the lines, it appears that God called Aaron out of Egypt and said, come meet your brother Moses. Because the story shows Moses and Zipporah and his son Gershon meeting with Aaron, and then them turning and going back towards Egypt. But how old was Aaron at this point? Anybody know? And it is stated later in one of the other books. So
Aaron would have been younger than Moses, right?
you had a 50-50 chance.
No, he was older.
He was 3 years older. He was 83 years old. Right? And this is one of the dangers. I think, Judy, it was you who said on WhatsApp, you kind of let the movies dictate your mental picture of all this stuff, right? So whether it was, the old Exodus movie with Charlton Heston, or whether it was the animated movie The Prince of Egypt, which showed him as a much younger man, right? Not true. He was 80 and 83 years old. They were elders.
But if you live to be 120, 80 would
80, that's right. It's kind of
80's
like
not
almost a
so
little
bad.
bit over middle age.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
the movie doesn't really show his age, because when he went back, it shows that he's all gray, he's
Yeah,
really
that's
beard, he does look
Yeah, that's
older.
true. He does look older, but he
does
doesn't.
look older.
Yeah.
It doesn't really say what his age was.
Yeah. Are you talking about the
The
Charlton Heston one?
Charlton
Yeah, for
Heston.
sure.
Oh.
Yeah. That one's certainly a little bit better than the animated movie.
That's my favorite.
Yeah, I love the Ten Commandments.
And
Yeah.
Mr. T loves that.
I remember watching that
That's
when I was
right.
a little boy.
Yeah. Actually, it was
Right,
when,
yeah.
one of the times when we
Nailed
were
it.
having fellowship at your house. You had the Ten Commandments on when we came in, and I went and I bought the movie like that next week, I think, and I watched it. And I hadn't seen it since I was a kid. It was awesome.
My dad took me to see that in the drive-in theater. when I first came
Really?
out.
Amazing.
Yeah, the Ten
Yeah.
Commandments.
Final question: What are the two names of the mountain where God spoke to Moses?
Sinai.
And
Mountain of God.
that's true, because it's referred to as the mountain of God. What else?
Mount Moriah.
Nope.
It's another mount.
Mountain.
Mount Horeb.
Yeah.
Horeb. And that's the first name that you see it. That's actually in the story of the burning bush. It's referred to as Mount Horeb, but we know that it's also Mount Sinai. Right? It's where he was called to go back, but also where God met him to give him the law. Now, last week we ended by defining what the law is or was and was not. So I just want to recap that very, very quickly. Let me just put all these up here just so we can get them on the screen. So very quickly, the law was not and is not a replacement for the Abrahamic covenant, right? The law was a temporary provision to call the nation of Israel to be part of the Abrahamic covenant, but it was also a way for individuals to be part of the collective nation, which allowed them, each individual, to be part of the Abrahamic covenant as well. The law was not and is not meant to be permanent and unconditional. God required obedience to the nation or from the nation to live in the land and required individuals to be obedient to the laws of the nature or laws of the nation, to be part of the Abrahamic covenant and to live in the land that was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the cost of disobedience was what?
Curses.
Curses, yes, but more specifically, eviction,
Cut off.
right? And that's where the Babylonian captivity came into play, at least on the national level. The law was not and is not nullified by the new covenant, at least the cursing side. And this goes back to what we were saying earlier today, that the law is still in effect, but it's the curse side, right? The blessing side of the law has been replaced by the new covenant, which acts like an escape clause where an individual under the law can escape the curse of the law by committing to Christ and clothing himself or herself with Christ. And we know that the blessing side will be reinstated at least for a period of time in the tribulation, but the context will be that it's reinstated to continue to point them towards the return of the Messiah. And finally, the law was not and is not an effective means of atonement. And we go back to what Paul said about the blood of bulls and goats could never really atone for sins. And each time that they sacrificed an animal, particularly Passover and the Day of Atonement, it was pointing to Christ as the ultimate propitiation for the sins of the individual as well as the nation. And because it was not meant to be an effective and permanent means of atonement, it had to be repeated each year.
That's like the original Yoruba went to Christ and they said, "What must I do to have eternal life?" And Jesus first told him, "Well, keep the law."
Mm-hmm.
He said, "Do all these things." Well, more, he says, "Okay, so everything you got, and come and follow me." So there was more that he did not possess to have eternal life, and it was about following Christ. In other words, the law was not sufficient.
Yeah.
It was only to direct us to Christ.
Absolutely. Yep. So we're going to deal with, actually, let me ask this, and I'm going to delay answering the question. If we know what the law is not and was not, then we have to ask the question, well, what exactly is the law? What does that mean? And I think the answer depends on what do you mean by the law, right? What are you actually referring to when you say that? And we're going to come back to that later. Right now, what I want to do is look at the time between when the Jews came out of Egypt, crossed the Red Sea, and when they got to Mount Sinai, where God actually gave them the law. So just look at this in terms of the general sequence of events. It started with the plagues of Egypt, right? And we're not going to go into details, all of that. You can read through Exodus if you want to look at all the plagues and how God used Moses and Aaron and all the miracles to get Pharaoh to the point where he was willing to let his people go. So we have the plagues of Egypt, which ended with the death of the firstborn throughout the entire land, both human as well as animal, and then the Passover, right? So the firstborn of the homes and the houses of the Israelites, they were passed over and they were spared. Then we see the parting of the Red Sea. Then we see the plunder of the Egyptians. God said when he gave that vision to Abraham, when Abraham fell into the deep sleep and we had the ritual covenant, or the covenant ritual, God basically said, your people are going to go through a period of affliction, and in the fourth generation, they're going to come out of bondage, but they're going to come out a rich nation, right? So,
That one should be like that.
what's that?
The plunder should be before.
Yeah, that's right. Plunder of the Egyptians should be before the parting of the Red Sea. But either way, you get the point. And then we have plenty of people. Notice all the P's. I thought that was cool. Everything falls into a P, right? How many people came out of Egypt?
A couple of million, I think, wasn't it?
How do you figure that out?
I don't remember.
Anybody have an idea?
1.5.
1.5? But how do we figure that out is the
Weren't there
question.
600,000 men?
Yeah, so
And
again,
you add the women and the kids.
Yeah.
And the non-Jews.
and the non-Jews, right? Because it said that what came out of Egypt was a mixed multitude, which means that people maybe that were visiting Egypt or some of the Egyptians kind of went, this God seems to be pretty powerful. I'm going to go where his people go. So it wasn't just the Jews that came out of Egypt. It was a mixed multitude. But Numbers, where Moses was told to take a census, when you add up all the numbers, it is 600,000 people, but he was only told to count men of military age, people who could fight. And this is pretty consistent throughout, that when you see this census type data, it's typically associated, or it is associated with, only males of fighting age. Now that, I think, in my opinion, has implications for things in the book of Revelation where it talks about the 144,000 faithful Jews that are sealed for protection during the tribulation. I believe that that is following the same convention where it's only counting men of military age, which we were talking about the number of people that came out of the Exodus. And I just want you to think back a moment about, the statements like 70 people went into Egypt. And, I suggested that it wasn't only 70 people, it was 70 men of military age plus all their families. There were probably a couple hundred people went into Egypt. And Exodus or Genesis actually said that, it was Exodus, that God basically blessed their procreation, right? And so they were very fertile, had lots of babies. And so it doesn't take all that long, even given just reasonably increased rates of population growth, for you to go from a few hundred people and in 200 years get up to hundreds of thousands, if not a couple million. Go to Exodus chapter 15.
It was all due to raisin cakes.
What's that?
It was all due to raisin cakes.
Yeah.
You know what that reference is?
No.
Raisin cakes. It's an aphrodisiac.
Raisin cakes?
Yes.
Really?
They talk about that when David, he was asked to multiply. I forgot where it was, but they gave raisin cakes.
That's interesting.
Where do you want us to go? Exodus where?
Exodus 15.
Hmm?
So what we're going to do, we're going to take a look at, and this is, pretty big picture. These events occur over a couple of different chapters. But if you remember from the time that they came out of Egypt to where they arrived at Mount Sinai, how long was that time frame? You remember?
7 weeks.
7 weeks, right? And that's exactly the time from Passover to Pentecost, because within this Mazzaroth sign of Libra, we see on the feast day calendar, we see the two feast days, Passover and Pentecost, right? Passover is, of course, celebration of coming out of Egypt, and from our perspective, looking back, the sacrifice of Christ, his crucifixion and resurrection. And then Pentecost is the giving of the law on Mount Sinai, but for us looking back on the early church time, it's Pentecost that we associate with Peter's sermon and the inauguration of the church, the modern church era. Important to realize or remember that every single person coming out of Egypt was born in Egypt, because this was the fourth generation. And if you remember, I think it was the very beginning of Exodus, it basically says this story begins after Joseph died, Joseph and all of his brothers. And so all the people going in would have been dead, because we're 4 generations out now. And the people coming out of Egypt in the Exodus, they were certainly free and they were liberated. However, they probably still had a slave mentality, right? And we see that playing out a couple of times as we go through. So Exodus 15, verse 22. So Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea. Then they went out into the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. So now we're 3 days on the other side of the parting of the Red Sea. Now they came to Marah. They could not drink the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore the name of it was called Marah. And the people complained against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" So he cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree. The Septuagint says, showed him a piece of wood. When he cast it into the waters were made sweet. Therefore he made a statute and an ordinance for them, and there he tested them, and said, "If you diligently heed the voice of the Lord your God, and do what is right in his sight, give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you which I have brought out of the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you." And if you have ever done any studies on the different names of the Lord, like Jehovah Jireh, he's my provider, Jehovah Nissi, and all this kind of stuff. These are some of the verses where those different names or titles for God come from. So if I am the Lord who heals you. Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 wells of water and 70 palm trees. So they camped there by the waters. Chapter 16, verse 1. And they journeyed from Elim, and all the congregation of the children of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the 2nd month after they departed from the land of Egypt. Then the whole congregation of the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And so we have 2 complaints happening within the period of about a month or so. And the children of Israel said to them, "Oh, that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat, and when we ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain quota every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not." And it shall be on the 6th day that they shall prepare what they brought in, and it shall be twice as much as they gather daily. So in this particular part of the story, God is teaching them the Sabbath principle, right? He wanted them on the 7th day to not gather any manna, so he gave them a double portion on the 6th day so that they could store up enough that on the 7th day they wouldn't have to gather and prepare food. And if you read through the story, later he gives very specific rules on, not taking too much, not taking too little, not leaving anything over, like leftovers for the next day, thinking, I better hoard this because God's not going to give it to me. And some people did that, and what ended up happening was whatever they left over the next day was actually rotten and full of worms and maggots. And so the question is, what was the point? What was God teaching them by saying, take only enough for what you need today, and I'll give you twice as much on the 6th day so that you can cover yourself on the 7th day? What was God teaching them?
To trust in his provision.
Trust in his provision, right? Skip down to verse 10. Now it came to pass, as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the children of Israel, that they looked out toward the wilderness, and behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. And the Lord said to Moses, saying, I have heard the complaints of the children of Israel. Speak to them, saying, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God. So it was that quails came up at evening and covered the camp, and in the morning the dew lay all around the camp. And when the layer of the dew lifted, there on the surface of the wilderness was a small round substance, as fine as frost on the ground. So when the children of Israel saw it, they said to one another, what is it? For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, this is the bread for which the Lord has given you to eat. This is the thing which the Lord has commanded. Let every man gather according to each need, 1 omer for each person, according to the number of persons. Let every man take for those who are in his tent. This is manna, right? So God gave them meat and he gave them manna. What does the word manna mean?
What is it? What is it?
It literally means what? Like, what's that? I mean, that's literally what manna means. Angel food, I like it. So obviously he's teaching them, like Walter said, he's teaching them to trust in his provision. In Exodus 17, we're not going to read it, but they get thirsty again. And this is where God tells Moses to strike the rock, and from the rock will come living water. And this is also the chapter in the second half where we see the first mention of this guy named Joshua. Right? He doesn't show up in the story until the middle part of Exodus 17. And Joshua was an Ephraimite. He was descended from one of the sons of Joseph. And of course, he's the one who eventually came to bring the Jews into the promised land. But in the end of Exodus chapter 17, the Amalekites come out to attack the Jews. And God tells Moses, send Joshua. And this is that story where Joshua goes up on basically the overlooking cliff over a valley, and he's got the staff of God in his hand, and he's got his arms up, and as long as his arms were up, then Israel prevailed. But if his arms got tired and dropped, then they started losing. And so Joshua, and I can't remember the name of the other guy, but one other guy basically had him sit down on a rock, and they held his arms up, and so Joshua was able to defeat the army of the Amalekites.
Easy
What is it? Amalekites. Thank you. I couldn't
The
say
other
that.
guy was Hur.
Hur. That's right. Hur. That's right. Joshua and Hur. So here are the takeaways from looking at the sequence. Right. We're talking about the period of time between the 7-week period before they arrive at Mount Sinai. What happened in that period of time? And it's very easy to read the story, and to read them as just little snippets, little isolated. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's interesting. But not until you zoom out and go, okay, now we have a period of time from the Red Sea to Mount Sinai. What happened in that period of time, and what's the lesson, what's the takeaway? And the takeaway is this. God is saying to his people, I will give you safety. I'm going to protect you when you can't protect yourself, because they came out of Egypt 2.5 million people strong, being chased by hundreds and hundreds of Egyptian chariots and warriors. Right? There's no way, had God allowed the Egyptian army to have access to the people. Because you remember, when they got backed up against the Red Sea, what happened? God stood between them. The pillar of fire, right? And on one side was darkness and one side was light. And so God separated them and protected them when there was absolutely no way that they could have protected themselves. Then he also said, I'm going to provide for your basic needs. They got thirsty, he gave them water. They got hungry, he gave them quail, and he gave them bread. And if you'll notice, in each of the circumstances, he said to Moses, I've heard my people. I've heard their complaints. And you see a lot of almost like patience and expectation, like I kind of knew it was going to be like this, and I'm going to tolerate it for a certain point, because what do we hear from God a little bit later down the road when the people continue to complain? What we hear is, how long are you guys going to keep complaining? It's like, have I not shown you enough of my strength and my provision and my authority and my power and my might? And at some point you can feel the frustration in the Lord rising and rising and rising with each time that they're disobedient. And then with the story of the Amalekite, I can say it again, the Amalekites, he basically said, I'm going to give you strength and victory. I'm going to give you strength and victory. And ultimately, when you put all these together, the lesson for this fledgling nation, because they're not even a nation yet, because that doesn't happen until they are given the law and they coalesce as a nation under the law. He's basically saying, I am strong and you can trust me. I will take care of you. I am strong and you can trust me. Now, I had said earlier, and this kind of brings us up right to the point where they're camped at the foot of Mount Sinai. And I asked earlier, what do we mean when we refer to the law, right? We define what the law was not and is not. The question then becomes, what is the law? And I asked you, what do you think I mean when I say, well, it just depends on what you mean when you say, what is the law? What are you actually referring to? So what are you referring to when you think about the law?
Well, the law would be the Mosaic covenant when God gave him the 10 commandments and the following commandments after that.
Okay.
If not, it would be the Noah laws before that. The Abraham was.
So is the law the 10 commandments? Is the law the
600
oral tradition?
613 commandments.
Is it the Torah or the Pentateuch, which is the Greek version or the Greek word for Torah? Well, it's not the Greek word for Torah, but it basically means 5 books. Is it the book of the law? Because we see that phrase several times, the book of the law. Or is it specifically the 613 laws that, from our perspective, we go, the law of Moses got 613 laws that you have to follow? Right? And I'm sure most of you have heard that, because I think we've mentioned to it a couple of times before. Where did this idea that there are 613 laws come from? What verse and chapter can you point to in the Bible that lists 613 laws explicitly? So you can go number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 612.
Didn't it come from the rabbis over time? Didn't all of these laws evolve over time?
That's a good question,
The
right?
law of
I
divorcement.
mean, they started with 10 and then they added to it with the oral law.
Did they start with 10?
Well, I assume.
Those
I mean, they did, but was everything that is embodied in this concept of law, was everything else aside from the 10 Commandments oral tradition only?
No.
Anybody know who that picture is of?
Not really.
I didn't expect anyone to, but it's kind of dramatic to ask, though. It's this guy's name is Maimonides, and he was a 12th century Jewish rabbi and philosopher. He was born in somewhere in Spain. He lived most of his life, I think it was in Morocco and Egypt. So this is during the medieval period, right? We're talking about 1140, 1150 years after Christ was born. And his name, even though he's known as Maimonides, his actual name is Moses ben Maimon. I kind of think it's interesting that his first name was Moses. And he's just widely regarded as the most influential Torah scholar of all time. The most influential. And he's the man who said that there are 613 laws in the Torah. He wrote a 14-volume book called the Mishnah Torah that was basically an exhaustive work and treatise on Jewish law and Jewish ethics. But now remember, we're talking about 1100 years or so after Christ and after the destruction of the temple. But not all rabbis over the centuries have agreed on how to count the laws. So just because Maimonides said there was 613, and that's what we all were taught and what we all believe, you can't go anywhere in the Bible and see law number 1, law number 2, all the way up to 613. These 613 laws are basically a reflection of the interpretation of a single man on how do you group all of the instructions to do things or not do things included in the Bible, and based on how I think, I add them up and there's 613. Other scholars come up with different numbers. Either way, there's no chapter or verse that we can point to see a list of those 613 laws that are explicitly spelled out in the Bible.
Not by numerical. I never sat and counted, but started at number 1 in the Ten Commandments. He continues on and gives all these commands and judgments as he lays down all the way through chapter 23.
Yeah, we'll talk about some of those coming up here. So exactly what does the word law refer to?
Torah.
The Torah, right? And we've heard and we've used that word many times before, right? So I want to make sure that we understand what that means. So in modern times, the word Torah refers both to a written and an oral law. But to be very strict, the word Torah refers to the 5 books of Moses. You know, the written Torah: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Numbers, and then Deuteronomy. However, you also hear phrases, and you see this in the Bible, both in the Old and New, you hear the phrase the law and the prophets, right? And if you guys want, I'll take a screenshot of this and I'll post it on WhatsApp later, so you can download it if you want to. So we see the phrase the law and the prophets, and that's what we refer to as the Tanakh. And Tanakh is actually an acronym. It's the first letter of Torah, which refers to the written Torah, which is called the teaching. The N stands for the Nevi'im, which is the writing of the major and the minor prophets. And the K stands for the Ketuvim, which would be the writings. And that would be things like Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Job and 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, like the history books. And all of those things together equal what we call the Old Testament. So the Tanakh is the Old Testament. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible, speaking very strictly, but the word Torah, at least from a Judaistic standpoint, includes the oral tradition. And what is the oral tradition? Well, the Orthodox Jews believe that at least part of the oral Torah was given directly to Moses on Mount Sinai, so that what Moses wrote down in the 5 books was not the entirety of what God had actually said to him or spoke to him. And that oral tradition, the oral Torah, not recorded, was handed down by speaking, right? Handed down orally from generation to generation until what's called the First Jewish-Roman War. And that's the war that led to the destruction of the temple in AD 70. So for about 4 years or so prior to the destruction of the temple by Titus, Jerusalem was actually controlled by rebels that had kind of seized control of the city. And then we have the whole story of Titus, going back and forth and doing battle with different things. And finally he came in and he took over and he destroyed the temple. But he didn't just destroy the temple, he destroyed the priesthood. And in this first, because there were 3 Jewish-Roman wars over probably the next 60 or 70 years. In the first Jewish war, about 1.1 million Jews died in Jerusalem and Israel, either because directly as a result of the war or because of famine and starvation. But not long after that, the Jews realized that because they weren't the biggest kid on the block and they were constantly being conquered by other armies and other nations, they realized that without a temple, without a priesthood, that their oral traditions were at risk. And so in the early 3rd century, between the years 200 and 2020 AD, the oral tradition, the oral Torah, was written down in what's called the Mishnah. They were codified by this guy named Judah ben Hanasi. And so he took all the oral traditions that were held to by different groups and different teachers, and he wrote them down. It took him 20 years to do it. And the Mishnah formed the basis for rabbinical Judaism. Now, what is rabbinical Judaism? Does anybody know?
Judaism, that's rabbinical.
Well, who was in charge at the time of Christ before the destruction of the temple?
The Pharisees.
Pharisees, right? So that period of time was, considered to be Pharisaic Judaism. But once the temple was destroyed, the priesthood was destroyed and disbanded, then somewhere along the way, these rabbinical scholars and teachers became the authorities on what the Torah meant, right? And it wasn't just the written Torah; it wasn't just the 5 books of the Old Testament, that the books of Moses. They relied heavily on the teachings of the rabbis themselves. And so rabbinical Judaism grew out of Pharisaic Judaism, and it was a natural transition because of the destruction of the temple and the disbanding of the priesthood. Because at the time, the priests were the experts on what the law said.
Just doesn't it seem like Moses took such great care to write everything down that he would be very careful to write down every nuance of
Everything that
God's
we needed,
law?
yeah.
It's the only thing that oral tradition, you just
Yeah, exactly,
Right.
and that's part of what I'm trying to get at. But the Mishnah is only half of what's called the Talmud, because the Talmud refers to the written version of the oral Torah. But the Talmud, and the basis of rabbinical Judaism, is not just the written version of the oral Torah. It also includes something called the Gemara, and the Gemara. Basically, the Mishnah was printed, it was published, it was distributed to Jews throughout the Middle East area, and eventually scholars started to write commentaries. These rabbis started to write commentaries on the interpretation of the Mishnah, on the interpretation of ethics and laws related to civil disputes and all this kind of stuff. And these laws, the interpretation, the commentary of the written version of the oral Torah is what's called the Gemara. However, go ahead.
Wasn't there originally 2 Talmuds? One was the Assyrian, one was Babylonian?
That's where I'm going.
Okay.
Yep. So while there is one Mishnah, there was one written version of the oral Torah, which was written by this guy Judah Hanasi. There are 2 Gemaras. There are 2 kind of recognized interpretations of what the Mishnah means and how to apply that. The first one is called the Jerusalem Talmud, which was written about 400 AD. And the second is called the Babylonian Talmud, which is written by a different group of scholars in Babylon, Jewish scholars in Babylon. And these were Jews who stayed behind once Cyrus let the Jews go back and repopulate the city and repair the wall and the temple. Jews stayed behind and lived in Babylon. And these scholars wrote what's called the Babylonian Talmud. And generally, when you hear the word Talmud, usually it refers to the Babylonian Talmud. And that was written about 100 years afterwards. And as I said a moment ago, the Talmud forms the basis for rabbinical Judaism. And rabbinical Judaism today is by far the most common form of Judaism, but it's not the only one. The Orthodox Jews follow rabbinical Judaism, and to them, the Talmud is considered as important as the written Torah. And some rabbis elevate the Talmud, which again is the Mishnah plus some rabbis' interpretation of what it means. And the Gemara really is a compilation. It's not one person's work. It's a collection of writings by Talmudic scholars over many different centuries. But many elevate the Talmud and the rabbinical writings above the written Torah and actually believe that the rabbinical interpretation of the Torah is actually more important than the written version itself, which goes back to exactly what you were saying. So here's a question. If you were a Christian getting ready to study the Bible and all you ever did was read somebody else's opinion about what the Bible said, but you never actually read the Bible itself, would you be likely to come to the right conclusion all the time?
No.
Probably not, especially if the books that you read have different opinions about what the Bible actually says or what it actually means.
That's why we have a problem in Christianity today. People buy these study Bibles that have commentaries by theologians who are very biased in what they believe. And a lot of people, instead of
studying the scriptures, they go to the commentaries to try to tell them what it means.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why we have
Or even worse, they just read books by like Joyce Meyer or
yeah.
Creflo Dollar or who's the big smiley guy again?
Joel
Joel Osteen.
Osteen.
Like make every Friday, make every Friday your best Friday or something like
Or
that.
Spurgeon or Barr.
Yeah.
So people
Yeah.
read these are great scholars. Well,
Yeah, so you know what's
of bad
interesting to me
theology.
is that some of the complaints that we have about the modern Christian church, and I'm using it in that universal sense, it's the same thing that you see in Judaism. I wonder, based on our discussion this morning in our discussion time about talking about how in the world of Islam you have the fundamentalist extremists, and most people make the mistake of thinking all Muslims are like them, and they're not. But there's probably even within the Muslim faith different people who place different emphasis on or elevate to a certain degree either the actual Quran or someone's interpretation of what the Quran says, right? And I know in the world of the Muslim faith that's a big, and I don't know what the terminology is. I think it's called the Hadith or something like that, and they basically rely on the interpretation of somebody else. This guy Maimonides added his 2 cents worth about 600 years later. In the 12th century is when Maimonides wrote his 14-volume book called the Mishneh Torah, also known as the Book of the Strong Hand. And this is where he said, hey, guess what? If you take everything written in the Torah and all the interpretations in the Talmud and the Gemara, then there's 613 laws that people have to follow.
Where was he living?
What's that?
Where was he living?
He lived mostly in Morocco and Egypt. He was born in Spain.
Yes.
He's what's called a Sephardic Jew.
Yes.
So he was born in Spain, but
Why he has the turban.
the turban, yeah. But he was widely regarded. In fact, he rose to prominence, and he was the leader of the Jewish group, I guess, or the Jews that were in Egypt at his time. But here's something very interesting, and I'm quoting from something called the Yad Maki, which is a writing of an 18th century rabbi. He says a decision, and he's talking about when there's a matter of interpretation with the law, with the Torah, says a decision may not be rendered in opposition to the view of Maimonides, even where he apparently militated against the sense of a Talmudic passage, for in such cases the presumption was that the words of the Talmud were incorrectly interpreted. Likewise, quote, one must follow Maimonides even when the latter opposed his teachers, since he surely knew their views, and if he decided against them, he must have disapproved their interpretation. So what does that do? It basically puts Maimonides as the sole arbitrator of the truth, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it changes your interpretation or your perception of, modern day rabbinical Judaism, but a lot of what is being taught as under the guise of the truth is a lot of people's opinions. That's probably the same for all religions.
And they kind of go one way or another way.
Yeah, so there are different subgroups. Like even within rabbinical Judaism, it's not like all rabbis have the same opinion about what things mean. And if you read some of the teachings in some of these, the rabbinical texts, there's a lot of interpretation based on allegory and metaphor. Well, this number means this, and Moses was 120 years old, and that's why we see the number 120 over here, because it connects these two things together. And there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of bias. There's a lot of self-made interpretation there. There's a sect of rabbinical Judaism. Actually, they're not rabbinical Jews. They're called Karaites. And they are basically a group that believes that the oral Torah, not all Jewish sects believe that the oral Torah was given to Moses. The Karaites are one group that believes that only the written Torah, the first 5 books, are canonical. Meaning that is the truth. Like, we don't need someone else's opinion. If we want to know what the law is, we read what Moses wrote.
Yes.
And we take it literally, and we read it plainly. and we read it simply. And they oppose this rabbinical focus on the Talmud and the Gemara specifically with the interpretations of what all that means. They were more numerous in the past. Estimates right now that I could find, there's only about 50,000 Karaite Jews scattered. Most of them are in Israel. I think about probably about 40,000. Then you've got several thousand, like in Turkey. There's several. I think about 4,000 here in the United States. So when you and I talk about Judaism, we tend to do it in a homogeneous sense. We just think that all Jews believe the same stuff and they do the same things, and that's absolutely not true. It's not true. So when we refer to the law, what are we referring to?
The written Torah?
Yeah, for us, it's the written Torah, right? Because we don't want to get into man-made interpretation that is separated. Because and this is my next question, when did Moses write the law? And when we use the law, we're meaning the law, the 5 books of Moses, not just the 10 Commandments, because clearly there's more than just the 10 Commandments in the writing of Moses. So when did Moses start writing the law? Well, first of all, in God's timeline, going from year 1 as the first year of creation, when did the Exodus happen?
No. 2,000 years after?
Close. Abraham was born the year 2000. The Exodus happened on the Jubilee of Jubilees. It was 2,500 years Anno Domini, which was about 1,500 years before Christ. Right? So 500 years after Abraham. But I want to show you, before we answer the question, when did Moses begin to write the law? I want to show you a couple of things in Deuteronomy first. Go to Deuteronomy 17. I'm going to read a couple of passages here. We don't have all that much left to go through, so we'll be done fairly soon. Deuteronomy 17:14. Now, Deuteronomy is Moses' speech that happens at the end of the 40 years wandering in the wilderness. So we'll deal with what happened after Mount Sinai. We'll deal with Kadesh Barnea and all that stuff over the next several weeks. Deuteronomy 17:14. When you come to the land, and he's talking to the children of the people who refused to go into the promised land. He said, when you come into the land which the Lord your God is giving you, and possess it and dwell in it, and say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are around me. So the point where the Jews said, hey, we want a king too, and they chose Saul, Moses predicted that. Moses predicted it. So he said, when you say I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me, you shall surely set a king over you, whom the Lord your God chooses, one from among your brethren you shall set as king over you. You may not set a foreigner over you who is not your brother. But he shall not multiply horses for himself. He's talking about the king, right? He's saying the king shouldn't be in this for himself. He said he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. For the Lord has said to you, you shall not return to that way again. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself. Think about Solomon, or David for that matter. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. Also it shall be when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, notice this, that he shall write for himself a copy of this law in a book, from the one before the priests, the Levites. And it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord of his God, and be careful to observe all the words of the law and these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted above his brethren, that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right or to the left, that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel. Go to Deuteronomy 31:9. Deuteronomy 31:9. So Moses wrote this law and delivered it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who bore the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and to all the elders of Israel. And Moses commanded them, saying, at the end of every 7 years, at the appointed time in the year of release, at the Feast of Tabernacles, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God in the place which he chooses, you shall read this law before all Israel in their hearing. Gather the people together, men and women and little ones, and the stranger who is within your gates. And those are, again, Gentiles who have converted to Judaism, that they may hear and they may learn to fear the Lord your God and carefully observe all the words of this law, and that their children who have not known it may hear it and learn to fear the Lord your God as long as you live in the land which you cross the Jordan to possess. Skip down to verse 23. It says right at the end, when Moses is about to go up the mountain to die, because he wasn't allowed to go into the promised land, then he inaugurated Joshua the son of Nun and said, be strong and of good courage, for you shall bring the children of Israel into the land which I swore to them, and I will be with you. So it was when Moses had completed writing the words of this law in a book, when they were finished, that Moses commanded the Levites who bore the ark of the covenant of the Lord, saying, take this book of the law and put it beside the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, that it may be there as a witness against you. For I know your rebellion and your stiff neck. If today, while I am yet alive with you, you have been rebellious against the Lord, then how much more after my death? Gather to me all the elders of your tribes and your officers, that I may speak these words in their hearing and call heaven and earth to witness against them. For I know that after my death you will become utterly corrupt and turn aside from the way which I have commanded you, and the evil will befall you in the latter days, because you will do evil in the sight of the Lord to provoke him to anger through the work of your hands. So we just read 3 separate passages there over 2 different chapters. And what we see here, and this is again a few decades after the time at Mount Sinai, we see that there's this thing called the Book of the Law. And we see that the Levites kept a copy of the Book of the Law. And that eventually when Israel was to have a king, the king was to take a copy of the Book of the Law that the priest had, and he was to handwrite his own copy and continue to study that throughout the rest of his life. So when did Moses begin to write the Book of the Law? Certainly before his death, right? That's an easy one.
After the delivery, like during the wandering, right?
During the wandering? Like after Kadesh Barnea?
After he was given the 10 Commandments.
After he was given the 10 Commandments. Go back to Exodus chapter 18. In Exodus 18, the Jews are approaching Mount Sinai for the first time. And Moses finds himself being the judge among all these different disputes, and he's spending most of his time arbitrating between 2 different people who are upset with each other for some reason. So in Exodus 18:15, Moses said to his father-in-law, because the father-in-law is like, hey, what are you doing all the time? And he says, because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a difficulty, they come to me, and I judge between one another, and I make known the statutes of God and his laws. And this is that story where Jethro basically says, okay, here's what you do. You deal with the big stuff, appoint judges to deal with the little stuff. So, appoint judges over hundreds and tens and let them deal with the day-to-day stuff. And if they can't figure it out, they can come to you, so it'll reduce your workload, right? And basically, God gave them in that moment, through Jethro, God gave this fledgling nation, which didn't have a codified set of laws yet, he gave them an authority structure. Basically a justice system, right? And then he took the system and he poured the law into it. But here's what I want to point out here. In verse 16, Moses says, when they have difficulty to come to me, they come to me, and I judge between them, and I make known the statutes of God and his laws. Where and how did Moses learn what God's statutes and laws were?
He had to have written them down. Well, he did. First he had the commandments that God wrote. He had to write them down to always reference back to them.
I don't remember the story, and when I came across it, I'm like, oh, I forgot about that, or didn't spot it the last time I read through Exodus. But there's a story later on where someone comes to Moses, and forgive me, I don't have the reference. Someone comes to Moses to inquire of the Lord, and basically Moses goes, hang on, let me check. Okay, God said this. I mean, it's almost like God was communing with him. I mean, we see this, right? He's talking to God up on the mountain. When the presence of the Lord came and occupied the mercy seat when they were in the tabernacle in the wilderness, Moses would go in and would talk to him face to face. So there was seems to be, at least up to this point, some kind of direct communication, because Moses was judging people's complaints and queries against whatever God had taught him. Whether he wrote it down at that point, we don't know, but I would imagine he had at least a fundamental understanding of what God required of his people.
Because he told Pharaoh he wanted to take them out to worship God and to...
And he obviously knew how that was going to happen and what that should look like, or at least he trusted God to show them at the time. Exodus chapter 19, God descends on Mount Sinai in smoke and fire. Exodus chapter 20, God gives the 10 Commandments, and the people choose Moses to talk to God on their behalf, because when he descended in smoke and fire and thunder and lightning, he scared the bejeepers out of them. And they're like, we're terrified. We want you to go talk to God and then come back and tell us what he said. Now go to Exodus chapter 21, the very beginning. Because right at the end of the 10 Commandments, God doesn't stop there. He doesn't stop there. He says in 21:1, now these are the judgments which you shall set before them. And the very first thing he deals with is having a Hebrew servant. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he shall serve 6 years, and in the seventh he'll go free and pay nothing. And so what we see in chapter 21 to chapter 23, God gives laws concerning, and this is beyond the 10 Commandments, right? He gives laws concerning indentured servitude, violence, laws regarding animals. He outlines responsibility for property and damage to property. He outlines rules for personal integrity. He outlines rules that regulate the Sabbath and the annual feasts. He talks about the 7th-day Sabbath and the 7th-year Sabbath. And then he gives them the 3 required festivals. Every year all of your adult males will gather for Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. And these are, of course, the feasts that are going to be celebrated in the kingdom. Go forward to Exodus chapter 24. Because here's what's important. God gave the 10 Commandments from the mountain, and what Moses wrote in Exodus 21, 22, and 23, he wrote. Obviously, it's in our book. We can read it, right? So he started writing stuff very, very early, like Kathy was saying, right? Exodus 24:1. Now God said to Moses, come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship from afar. And Moses alone shall come near the Lord, but they shall not come near, nor shall the people go up with them. So Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the judgments. And the people answered with one voice, all the words which the Lord has said we will do. Verse 4, and Moses wrote all the words of the Lord. This is where he started writing things down. After God appeared on Mount Sinai and spoke the 10 Commandments and gave more verbal instruction that he wrote in verses 21, 22, and 23, when God called him up with the 70 elders and continued to instruct him, this is when Moses wrote all the words of the Lord. This is the beginning of the book of the law. And he rose early in the morning. He built an altar at the foot of the mountain and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. Then he sent young men of the children of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. And Moses took half the blood and put it in basins, and half the blood he sprinkled on the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read in the hearing of the people, and they said, all that the Lord has said we will do, and be obedient. And Moses took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, this is the blood of the covenant which the Lord has made with you according to all these words. Then Moses went up with Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and 70 of the elders, and they saw the God of Israel. And there was under his feet, as it were, a paved work of sapphire stone. It was like the very heavens in his clarity. But on the nobles of the children of Israel he did not lay his hand. So they saw God, and they ate and drank. Then the Lord said to Moses, come up to me on the mountain and be there, and I will give you tablets of stone and the law and commandments which I have written, that you may teach them. So Moses arose with his assistant Joshua, and he went up to the mountain of God. So when did Moses start writing the book of the law? Before he even got the stone tablets is when he started writing it down. So verse 4, Moses writes the word of the Lord. He calls it the book of the covenant in verse 7. An interesting side note in verses 10 and 11, the leaders of Israel who were told not to come up to the Lord did, and they saw him, and God didn't destroy them. And it said they saw the Lord, and they ate and they drank. So if they saw God, was it the Father or the Son? It was the Son, right? In verse 12 says God said, come up and I'll give you the stone tablet. So right after God appeared on Mount Sinai, and again scared the living daylights out of the people, Moses started to write the book of the law, the book of the covenant, and he got all of the leaders of all the tribes to agree. And that's that picture where they sacrificed an animal, and half the blood he sprinkled on the altar, and then he sprinkled it on the people. He read the book of the law and said, now you're bound. This is the book of the covenant. And I thought it was, when I was reading this morning, it just, all I could think of was Jesus and the Passover meal. This is the blood. This is my blood. This is the blood of the covenant. And now, of course, because we've been going through this, it brought my mind all the way back to Melchizedek, who brought out the bread and the wine. So after he appeared on Mount Sinai, and before Moses got the 10 Commandments on the stone tablets the first time, because if you remember, Moses ended up with 2 sets of stone tablets because he broke the first one. You got anybody remember why he broke the first one?
Because while he was gone, they reverted back to paganism.
Yeah.
Real
So
quick.
when
It didn't take long.
no, it didn't. When Moses went up, and he was only up there for like 6 days. So God calls Moses up and he shows him how to build the ark. He gives him instructions on the mercy seat, how to build the temple, the tabernacle or the tent, the implements, and the altar to be used in service. He gave him instructions for the priestly garments, how to consecrate the priests, and what the daily offerings were to be. He also gave him instructions on incense and anointing oil, and the whole while down below, Aaron is melting down gold to make a calf to worship. Now, we're going to end our discussion of Libra and the law there, and I intentionally didn't go into all the details of the 10 Commandments and all that kind of stuff, but I thought the history of what is commonly called the law today, including the oral teachings of the rabbis, and that body of work didn't even come into being until the 12th century after Christ, right? So when we talk about the law, we're using it in the traditional historical sense that it's the first 5 books of Moses, which according to the book of Exodus, he started to record these things after God appeared on Mount Sinai, even before he got that first set of clay tablets. And personally, sometimes I'll read rabbinical teachings, but it's really more for historical context. I just don't think we should put much stock in them. Just like we shouldn't put much stock, even though I do read Christian commentaries, I do it just to stimulate a thought process to see if somebody has thought about something that I haven't had, which happens all the time, of course, because I don't think of everything. Questions or comments?
It's the first time I ever saw that the leaders met God and had food with them, and he was standing on a sapphire stone. Has anyone else ever read that?
Well, obviously,
And
we've
I've read
all
through
read
it. I've
We've
read it.
You just,
Didn't see it.
Joe and I were talking on the way coming down today about how the Bible is so much more alive and means so much more because of the understanding we've accumulated by teachings in Oasis, and it's invaluable.
Mm-hmm.
It's so different.
Yeah, I find myself reading verses and passages and chapters over and over and over again. And it's just like you're just kind of scraping at the surface, and all of a sudden you get below the surface, and you're like, wow, it's been there the whole time. What does it mean? Because God, in that particular instance, God said, bring these men up, but don't let them come all the way, because I'll kill them. But they ended up going all the way, and they saw him, and they sat down, and they ate, and it basically said that the God relented and did not kill them. But they saw him. But that, again, goes back to, and that's why I asked, who was it, the Father or the Son? Because a lot of people think that it was the Father that showed up on Mount Sinai, but it was not. It was the Son. Because no man has seen the Father and lived. All right, any other questions or comments? No? All right.
Is this what our faith is based on?
What do you mean?
When we say we're Judeo-Christian nation. This is what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we have to be very careful about looking at modern rabbinical Judaism and taking much from them that is not easily corroborated within the 5 books of Moses. Right? And remember that specifically the Torah means the 5 books. The Tanakh is what we call the Old Testament. And the rest of the Old Testament, the writings and the prophets, obviously the prophets are critically important because, Christ even said, right, upon all these things hang the law and the prophets. But the writings, it's all history, right? And there are some cases where I think we have to be careful deriving doctrine or defining theological positions based on history. Sometimes we can do that, but even, for example, things that we read in the book of Acts. The book of Acts is not a doctrinal book, it's a history book. And there's only so much that you can derive from that in terms of defining doctrine. One of the biggest examples of making that mistake would be looking at what happened at Pentecost and saying, well, the proof of a spirit-filled believer is speaking in tongues, because that's what happened in the early church. Well, that's just what happened. It doesn't mean that that's the way it will always happen. But there are groups that say if you don't speak in tongues, you're not saved. And that's the danger of deriving doctrine and theology just strictly from a historical narrative. It has to fit with absolutely everything else. Final comments or questions?
It's fascinating.
It's good stuff, yeah. Yeah. All right, let's pray.